The Book of Ruth is one of the Ketuvim, or writings, a group of compositions which also includes Proverbs and Job. Ruth is typical of the genre in that a seemingly unassuming plot acts as the vehicle for multiple layers, worked in a way which dialogues with earlier biblical material. And it is generally accepted that the story is so arranged as to stand as a direct riposte to Ezra and Nehemiah, the purge of Judahite society which followed the return from exile in the 6th century BCE. So, to our plot. In the time when the judges gave leadership in Judah, a young couple of economic migrants left Bethlehem for a better life in Moab. Life was indeed better, and they remained there long enough to raise 2 sons who married. 10 years later, the menfolk were all dead, and the mother, Naomi, decided it was time to return home. The 3 women packed up and set off, and on the way, Naomi turned on her daughters-in-law and announced that they should return to their parents. One accepted this, but the other, Ruth, was determined to continue. A robust conversation ensued, and eventually they arrived in Bethlehem together. From this point, there is little evidence that Naomi so much as left the house. Ruth managed to feed them by gleaning during the harvest. She attracted the attention of the richest man in town, who favoured her quite outrageously. She eventually married him, bearing a son. The book closes with the village women announcing that a child is born to Naomi and that her daughter-in-law Ruth is worth 7 sons. Ideology has permeated reception of the Book of Ruth within the church. Ideology of sisterhood, of religious conversion, ideology of feminine virtue, which has used Ruth to demonstrate that women are legitimate recipients of blessing only as caregivers and mothers, under the authority of a male, in the service of patriarchy. Elders are obeyed without question. And representatives of divine revelation, in this case Naomi, are paragons of untrammeled virtue. Ruth's perceived obedience is praised or criticised, depending on whether or not the commentator is a feminist, as if it were a matter of free choice on her part. The problem is that very little of this actually has much to do with the original composition. I suggest that we take a look at Ruth with Orange is the New Black in mind. Were we making a new film version, who might we cast as Naomi, the mother figure? Naomi is the epitome of a woman who might find herself on the wrong side of the law if pushed too far. In time of famine, most Judahites would head west and then south to Egypt. Not Naomi. She goes in the opposite direction to Moab, the disreputable desert neighbour. The fact that the family settles there, finding it preferable to Bethlehem, the house of bread, suggests that they were poverty-stricken before the famine, or not overly bright. Naomi's abandoning of her daughters-in-law mid-track is irresponsible in the extreme. She whines about how hard life is for her and accuses them of clinging to her like parasites, most probably projecting her own less desirable traits. She's relatively indifferent to Ruth's well-being, and after the harvest decides that Ruth is to go to Boaz by night and proposition him sexually. Naomi describes this as seeking rest for Ruth. Church teaching has, of course, explained that Naomi seeks a respectable marriage, and that when Ruth conceives a child, Boaz will marry her, and that this is how things were done at the time. It is difficult to imagine a more unrealistic construal. In the book of Judges, men do not marry strange women who conceive their children. They may raise the child, Jephthah, in Judges 11 as a case in point, but prostitution is not a route to marriage or rest. Naomi is a relative of Boaz. There is no reason for her to resort to living off her daughter-in-law's immoral earnings, but she attempts to do just that. We know very little about her, but if this scenario were played out in Orange is the New Black, we would understand it to be the strategy of a deeply damaged woman who could not imagine simply asking for and receiving help. There are several partial matches for Naomi among the characters from the series. For Ruth, however, I can see broad similarities with one character in particular, Tasty. What kind of family gives a daughter to a penniless, landless immigrant family who will leave one day? Probably a marginal one, and one which places little value on a girl. Furthermore, it is to this family that Ruth refuses under any circumstances to return when Naomi commands it. Whatever Naomi's attitude, whatever disadvantage she will face as a foreigner, as a single woman, as an unwanted, barren daughter-in-law, Ruth is going to Bethlehem. There is no reason to view her decision as a radical religious choice or as a sentimental preference for an endearing relative. Ruth's choice is of the same type as Tasty's, who begs Vi to take her out of foster care. She knows Vi is a criminal. She knows she is cruel. But her foster father is abusing her, and she chooses the less bad of the two available options. Even as an adult, Tasty remains vulnerable to emotional blackmail. The mother figure derives power from having provided an illusion of family life, albeit one experienced as a dream come true for her foster daughter. A similar mechanism may explain Ruth's partial obedience in going to the threshing floor to proposition Boaz, or maybe she simply sees no other choice in the absence of any other ally. The details of Tasty's obedience to Vi are unknown to us, but it has resulted in her incarceration. Ironically, it is the safety of the repressive structure of prison in the one case and marriage in the other, which each woman takes as her own, and within which she will emerge as an emancipated, authentic subject. Ruth makes quite an impression on Boaz when they meet. She's loud. She enjoys being the centre of attention. She asks for more than it is customary to give a destitute woman. She turns Boaz's words around, parodying his pompous speech, and clearly intimidates him. This does not stop him from being impressed and ultimately marrying her, but it is at her initiative, not his. When Ruth goes to him, she does not lie down silently and await instructions as Naomi has told her to do. She tells him who she is and asks for his help. And it is Ruth, not Boaz, who puts together the legal argument that ultimately makes the marriage possible. In all this, larger than life, loud, inappropriate, and wielding a formidable intellect and work ethic, Ruth and Tasty have many characteristics in common. Most telling of all, neither woman describes herself as poor, nor seeks pity, nor wastes time on regret. It would be odd to set aside centuries of wisdom in favour of a reading inspired by a popular television series. However, if one reads outside the discursive commentaries and draws from the social sciences to better understand biblical material, the conclusions tend to be more in line with Orange is the New Black than with Sunday school teaching. Books such as Social Scientific Old Testament Criticism, published by this very university, reflect the established practice of applying social scientific research to biblical studies. Indeed, it is not difficult to find research which speaks to the issues explored in the Book of Ruth specifically. One example is a 2011 paper from the International Journal of Social Work describing the experiences of Mumbai prostitutes who had been sold into brothels by family members. The women were generally from rural backgrounds, childless and widowed or abandoned. Many had been sold by their own male relatives, others by their mothers-in-law. India in the 21st century may seem to be a far cry from ancient Israel, or a minimum security prison in Connecticut. But it seems reasonable to infer that the scenarios of vulnerability and exploitation found in the one may be echoed in the others. Indeed, we might be closer to the intentions of the composers of the tale of Naomi and Ruth in exploring the grittier, real-world issues it represents than in seeking bland moral exemplars.